Hello, friends. Who better than the sheriff to know all the problems? Today we have a guest, Giorgione or Sergino Dest. The action takes place around 1880 in Dodge City, Kansas. Our sheriff, Dest, manages the city and the county. Outside the window, a real Wild West with constant gunfights, pubs, and gangs of robbers. In reality, at that time, the U.S. had strict laws. Carrying a gun was forbidden, and the armed people who arrived had to leave their guns in hotels or with the police. Sheriff Dest works in the county court, an important building like many others across the country. His day starts with paperwork, taxes, court decisions, public opinion. The sheriff is an elected person, so he has to be a good politician and keep an eye on popularity. The prison nearby usually held mostly criminals and tax evaders. Collecting taxes was his main task. He studies the rent debts, collects taxes from farmers, and plans the routes for their collection. He also monitors the implementation of court decisions, evictions, fines, etc. The whole district could be huge, and the sheriff could not cover everything personally. Marshals came to the rescue, who represented the law in villages and town. When you see a tiny town in a movie or game that supposedly has a sheriff, most often it is the marshal. They were the ones who maintained order on the ground and locked up criminals behind the bars of their offices. Well, the job of our Sheriff Dest is simply to come and pick up such a criminal, transporting him to the county jail. Often, our Sergino can delegate some of his powers to local marshals and instruct them to enforce court decisions or collect taxes. It is not hard to guess that this approach often turned into a problem, where corrupt marshals began to steal or use force where they were not supposed to. For example, this happened in the town of Thompson, where the local marshal, Virgil Erb, and his assistants got into a shootout with bandits. On the one hand, the marshals were trying to enforce the law, but on the other, County Sheriff John Bayan didn't like this approach and arrested the marshals for abuse of power. Well, the sheriffs themselves didn't use guns very often. There was, of course, the Black Bass Reeves, who arrested 3,000 people and shot 14 during his service. But there were also guys who had never even shot properly in their entire careers. After all, the position of sheriff in the Wild West, as you already understood, is mostly administrative work. One way or another, if our desk carries a revolver, it is definitely not in the form that is shown in the movies. Most often, the weapon was not worn on the hip, preferring a holster on the front part of the belt. After all, suddenly a weapon does not like unnecessary shaking, and in the Wild West they understood this, and revolvers were not particularly reliable, so sheriffs often preferred regular double-barreled guns. The same Virgil Erb bragged that he had a loaded gun hidden in almost every bar. In general, with a high degree of probability, our Sergino Dest will spend the whole day in the office of the county court, sorting out papers. But what if the peaceful routine is interrupted by a sudden attack of robbers? In this case, our Desti will resort to the law that is still in effect in the United States. It allows the sheriff to recruit civilians to maintain law and order. This is perhaps the most powerful weapon in the hands of any sheriff, and its use began with the fact that the U.S. authorities prohibited the use of the army to suppress civil conflicts. This is sad because sheriffs, marshals, and other law enforcement officers were scattered across large areas of the Wild West, and in the event of an organized attack, gangs found themselves in the minority. Therefore, if an attack on Dodge City takes place, our Desti will use the law and recruit civilians. Such squads often fought with robbers. A striking example is the war in Lincoln County, where the gangster squad of the legendary Billy the Kid was opposed by a squad of civilians assembled by Sheriff William Brady. However, in this case, the conflict began as a showdown between businessmen, and there is no clear right and wrong side in it. There were other sad examples where the squads assembled by the sheriffs turned into a legalized mafia. But most of all, there were positive examples where armed civilian squads helped maintain order in the city. Here we come across another myth, which claims that disorder was often brought about by the fall of the Indians. This is also a consequence of the influence of cinema. In reality, the Indians were not a threat not only to the sheriffs, but even to the settlers going along the road to the other end of the USA. Over 20 years in the mid-19th century, the Indians killed 362 migrants throughout the country. In turn, 426 Indians themselves were killed. These are not the numbers to talk about some kind of full-scale war. And since we are talking about numbers, how much does our daughter get for the work of the sheriff? This is, of course, a floating figure. The salaries that the sheriffs and the same marshals receive varied greatly depending on the territory. After all, our guy Sergini gets most of his income from taxes, and their amount depends on how many profitable businesses, fat railroad stations, and all that stuff are nearby. And the number of arrests had a direct impact on wages. For example, in Texas, a marshal was paid an extra $2 for paperwork, $4 for an arrest, and 5 cents per mile traveled during work. That same Virgil Earp, the marshal who started the shooting, received about $150 per month, plus a percentage of taxes and fines. Let's say our kid is honest and gets about $200 per month in total. That's a great salary because, on average, a factory worker in 1880 received about $45 for the same period of time. Rent for a small apartment cost $5 per month in those days. 12 eggs cost 11 cents. A pound of fresh pork or 10 kilograms of potatoes, 10 cents, and a pound of tea from Japan, 64 cents. Our sheriff's monthly salary was enough to buy about 180 kilograms of boneless beef or 250 kilograms of rice. If our sheriff decided to rent not a small apartment, but a house, there are records of 4-room houses in Kansas for $12 a month. In general, to say that the salary was enough is to say nothing. And this is not even mentioning the kickbacks and deductions that the sheriffs obviously had. Our DEST could also buy the latest models of weapons in industrial quantities. After all, the famous Winchester of 1876 cost $32 in the store, and the prices for ordinary double-barreled guns started at $7. A good horse could be bought for 50 cents and land for about 2 per acre. That is, to buy 1 square kilometer of land, our Sergino would have to invest 2 months in salaries. Not that much, right? It would be much more interesting to analyze the prices for a simple worker who works at a factory for $30 a month. For example, he would have to work for about 2 years to get 1 square kilometer of land. And even then, we are talking about uncultivated and wild land, which still requires investment. Well, our Sheriff Dest can afford these expenses. However, again, we should not forget that such endless joy does not last. The sheriff's elections could be either planned or extraordinary, and a candidate could always appear who would lure people's votes to his side. Well, we would like to finish by saying that the so-called the Wild West is a very short period of time by historical standards. In many people's minds, saloons, sheriffs, and shootouts have been attributes of America since the time of Columbus. But in reality, what is commonly called the Wild West is, at best, 100 years from the beginning of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th. Some scientists even put the mark at 30 years. The Wild West is a period when, under the influence of the gold rush and the banal search for a place to live, people from the east coast of the United States and migrants went west and actively colonized what is now the central and western states of the country. Yes, shootouts and showdowns happened there, but most often the law came to new territories quite quickly. And if you count, the Wild West in terms of murders was almost more civilized than modern times. Until next time.